Welcome to today's story, one that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Imagine moving into your dream home, ready to start a new life, only to realize that someone is watching your every move. What if that person held the power to make your life miserable? That's exactly what happened to Miguel, a hardworking Latino man who finally bought a house in an upscale gated community. He just wanted to renovate and make it feel like home. But the HOA President, Mrs. Thompson, wasn't happy about his arrival. She was convinced he didn't belong there. She believed he must be doing something illegal. She kept filing complaints, making threats, and calling city inspectors to stop his renovations. But what she didn't know was that Miguel had started looking into her past. And when he found out the truth about her, everything changed. This is a story of power, revenge, and unexpected justice. Miguel had worked his whole life to get here. As he pulled into the driveway of his new home, he let out a deep breath. This wasn't just any house, it was his dream home. A beautiful two-story house with a large front yard, nestled in an upscale gated community. The kind of place he never thought he could afford, but after years of saving and hard work, he had finally made it. He stepped out of his truck, looking at the house with pride. It needed a little work. Some fresh paint, a new fence, and maybe some landscaping, but it was his. As he carried the first few boxes inside, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. Across the street, a woman stood at her window, watching him. She wasn't just glancing, she was staring, her face tight with disapproval. Miguel tried to ignore it. Later that evening, as he unloaded furniture from his truck, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to see the woman from across the street walking toward him. She was older, maybe in her late 60s, dressed in an expensive beige sweater and slacks. Miguel put on his best polite smile. "Hi, can I help you?" She didn't smile back. Instead, she folded her arms and narrowed her eyes. "I'm Mrs. Thompson," she said. "I'm the president of the HOA." Miguel wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded. "Yes, I know," she said, her voice sharp. "And I have to say, I was a bit surprised. We don't usually have newcomers in this neighborhood." Miguel felt his stomach tighten. He knew what she meant. But he wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. "Well, I'm happy to be here," he said calmly. "Looking forward to making this place home." Mrs. Thompson pursed her lips. "I hope you understand that we have very strict rules here. The HOA exists to maintain the character of this community." Miguel nodded, still keeping his voice friendly. "Of course. I read the HOA handbook before I moved in." She tilted her head slightly, as if testing him. "Good," she said. "Then I assume you're aware that any exterior modifications to your home must be approved in advance." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "Sure. I was planning to submit some requests once I settle in." Mrs. Thompson exhaled sharply. "I just want to make sure you understand the process," she said. "We take violations very seriously." Miguel's patience was starting to wear thin. "I appreciate the heads up, Mrs. Thompson," he said. "But I promise, I'm not here to break any rules. I just want to fix up my house and be a good neighbor." Mrs. Thompson gave him a tight, fake smile. "We'll see." And with that, she turned and walked away. Miguel watched her go, a sinking feeling settling in his stomach. He had just moved in, and already, he had a bad feeling about this woman. Something told him that Mrs. Thompson wasn't going to make this easy for him. And he was right. This was only the beginning. Miguel had barely been in his new home for a week when the trouble began. At first, it was small things. He would catch Mrs. Thompson standing outside, staring at his house. Then came the first letter. It was an official-looking envelope from the Homeowners Association. "Dear Mr. Ramirez, it has come to our attention that you have failed to maintain the exterior of your home to community standards." Miguel sighed, shaking his head. His house did need some work, but he had barely finished unpacking. He had planned to start renovations next week. That afternoon, he walked across the street and rang her doorbell. The front yard was impeccably kept, with perfectly trimmed hedges and a garden full of bright flowers. The door swung open, and there she was. "Miguel," she said, crossing her arms. "Something I can help you with?" Miguel held up the letter. "I got this in the mail today. I just wanted to let you know I'm planning to repaint the house soon. I just need a little time." Mrs. Thompson narrowed her eyes, glancing at the letter. "Well, I hope you understand that standards are important here." Miguel felt his jaw tighten. "Neglect?" he repeated. "I just moved in last week." She shrugged. "That may be, but we expect immediate compliance." Miguel stayed calm. "I just want to make sure I'm being treated fairly. Did the previous owner get notices like this?" A brief flicker of something crossed her face. Was it panic? She quickly recovered. "I wouldn't know," she said smoothly. Miguel wasn't so sure about that. Still, he forced a polite smile. "All right. I'll start the work soon." Mrs. Thompson smiled back, but it wasn't friendly. Miguel kept his word. The next weekend, he hired a painter to refresh the exterior of the house. But just when he thought things were settling down, a second letter arrived. This time, it accused him of unauthorized work on his property. Confused, Miguel called the HOA office. Miguel clenched his fist. This was ridiculous. "That's not true," he said. "I followed the color guidelines exactly." "What's the problem?" The woman hesitated. "You should probably talk to Mrs. Thompson directly." Miguel exhaled sharply. This wasn't about HOA rules. Miguel had lived in the neighborhood for less than a month, and already, he had more violation notices than most homeowners had in years. Every time he fixed one issue, another complaint appeared. It started with the paint color dispute. Then came a complaint about his driveway. It was clear. She wanted him gone. One afternoon, Miguel was working on his backyard fence when he heard voices out front. "Can I help you?" Miguel asked, wiping the sweat off his forehead. One of the inspectors, an older man, looked up from his paperwork. "We received a report from the HOA about possible unauthorized construction on your property." The second inspector, a younger woman, glanced at the HOA complaint form. "It says here you're adding an unapproved structure. A possible illegal garage conversion." Miguel shook his head. "What? That's not true. There's no construction happening inside my house. You're welcome to take a look." The inspectors exchanged a look. "Would you mind if we do a quick walkthrough?" Miguel hesitated. He knew his rights. He could refuse entry. "Go ahead," he said, stepping aside. They walked through his home, checking each room. As expected, they found nothing. The older inspector sighed. "Well, everything looks fine. Sorry for the trouble, but we have to follow up on these complaints." Miguel nodded. "I get it. But can I ask, who filed this complaint?" The woman glanced at her paperwork. "Looks like Karen Thompson, HOA President." Miguel wasn't surprised. The inspectors left, apologizing again. But Miguel knew what this was. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just annoying. She was trying to get him in trouble with the city. That night, Miguel sat at his kitchen table, staring at the pile of HOA notices. This wasn't just about rules. She was targeting him. But why? Miguel decided to fight back. He needed proof that Mrs. Thompson was abusing her power. Step 1. Start documenting everything. He bought a small security camera and installed it near his front door. Step 2. Look into her past. He had a hunch that Mrs. Thompson wasn't as perfect as she pretended to be. So, he started digging. And that's when he found something interesting. An old news article. It was about a financial scandal in a different neighborhood, 10 years ago. And in the center of it all? A woman named Karen Thompson. Miguel's heart raced as he read. Was it the same Mrs. Thompson? If so, he had just found the first crack in her armor. And he was just getting started. Miguel sat at his laptop, staring at the screen. The article in front of him was old, buried deep in an archive from a small-town newspaper. A woman named Karen Thompson had been caught embezzling HOA funds in another neighborhood. She had been the HOA president there too, controlling everything. And then, one day, the money was gone. Tens of thousands of dollars had disappeared from the HOA's budget. The homeowners had demanded answers, but Mrs. Thompson had played the victim. She was never charged, but shortly after, she had quietly moved away. And now, she was here. Miguel felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just about harassing him. Mrs. Thompson was hiding something. Miguel knew he needed more proof. That night, he walked down to the HOA office, a small building near the entrance of the neighborhood. It was late, and the place was dark and empty. But as he looked around, he noticed something odd. There was a light on inside. He stepped closer and peeked through the window. Inside, Mrs. Thompson was sitting at a desk, flipping through paperwork. But she wasn't just reviewing documents, she was shredding them. Miguel's heart raced. She was getting rid of evidence. He quickly took out his phone and started recording through the window. For several minutes, she kept feeding paper after paper into the shredder, her face tense. Whatever she was hiding, it was big. Miguel knew he had just caught her in the act. The next morning, Miguel took his recording and the old newspaper article to City Hall. He met with a representative from the housing department, a middle-aged woman named Linda Garcia. She listened carefully as he explained everything, the fake complaints and harassment. When he showed her the video, she raised an eyebrow. "That's concerning," she said. "If she's destroying documents, that could be a problem." Miguel nodded. "I think she's stealing from the HOA." Linda sighed. "I can launch an audit of the HOA's finances, but it will take time." Miguel leaned forward. "What if I can get more proof?" Linda hesitated. "Be careful," she warned. "If she really is corrupt, she won't go down easily." Miguel knew she was right. But he wasn't backing down. The complaints keep coming. That evening, Miguel got another violation notice in the mail. But this time, it wasn't about his house. It was about his job. "Dear Mr. Ramirez, we have been informed that you are running a business from your home without HOA approval." Miguel's hands clenched the paper. She was trying to get him fired. She must have found out he was a contractor and decided to weaponize the HOA against his career. Miguel took a deep breath. If she thought he was going to give up, she was wrong. Because now, it was personal. Miguel was done playing nice. It was time to turn the tables. Digging deeper. That night, Miguel pulled up every public record he could find about Mrs. Thompson. He searched property records. Where had she lived before? He checked lawsuits. Had anyone ever taken her to court? He even looked at news articles, hoping to find more dirt on her past. And then, he hit the jackpot. There was another article. A second neighborhood scandal. This time, it was from 5 years ago, in a different town. Once again, an HOA president had been accused of financial fraud. Tens of thousands of dollars had been mismanaged. Money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance had simply disappeared. Karen Thompson. Miguel leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. She had done this before. More than once. A pattern of corruption. Miguel spent the next few days collecting evidence. He printed out the 2 news articles about HOA fraud linked to Mrs. Thompson. Copies of neighborhood complaints from past residents. Screenshots of bank statements from public records showing missing HOA funds. She had a pattern. Move into a wealthy neighborhood, become HOA president, control everything, then quietly steal money before disappearing. Miguel realized something else, too. She only targeted certain people. The people who couldn't fight back. Single parents. Elderly homeowners. Minorities. Newcomers who didn't understand how corrupt HOAs could be. She bullied them, forcing them to leave or pay endless fines, while she pocketed thousands of dollars. But this time, she picked the wrong person. Miguel wasn't going anywhere. A late-night warning. It was almost midnight when Miguel heard a noise outside. He looked out the window. Someone was at his truck. His heart raced as he grabbed his phone and rushed to the door. By the time he got outside, the person was gone. But the damage was done. The tires on his truck had been slashed. Miguel took a deep breath, his hands clenching into fists. This wasn't just about fines anymore. This was personal. Mrs. Thompson was sending a message. She thought she could scare him away. But she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because now, Miguel wasn't just fighting back. He was going to destroy her. Miguel stood in his driveway, staring at the slashed tires on his truck. His heart pounded with rage. This wasn't just a game anymore. Mrs. Thompson wasn't just trying to fine him out of the neighborhood, she was trying to intimidate him. But instead of backing down, Miguel did what he did best. He made a plan. Setting the trap. If Mrs. Thompson was bold enough to vandalize his property, then she was bound to slip up again. Miguel went to the local electronics store and bought 4 small security cameras. One for his front porch, covering the driveway. One for his backyard, in case she tried sneaking in. One disguised as a doorbell camera, in case she got too close. And one inside the house, just in case. He installed them that same night, making sure they were recording 24/7. And now, all he had to do was wait. The first break. It didn't take long. Just 2 nights later, Miguel's phone buzzed. Motion detected. He grabbed his phone and checked the live camera feed. And there she was. Mrs. Thompson. She was standing in his driveway. At 2 a.m. Miguel watched in disbelief as she walked up to his truck, looking around cautiously. Then, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle. Miguel zoomed in on the video feed. It was spray paint. Before he could even react, she shook the can and started spraying a word onto the truck's door. Miguel's stomach dropped. She was writing "illegal" in red paint. Miguel felt a surge of anger, but he also smiled. He had her. Calling the authorities. Miguel didn't confront her right away. He let her finish her dirty work. Then, first thing in the morning, he took the footage straight to the police. Officer James Carter, a tough-looking cop in his 50s, watched the video on Miguel's phone. When it ended, he sighed and rubbed his forehead. "Let me get this straight," Carter said. "This woman is the HOA president?" Miguel nodded. "And this is just the tip of the iceberg. She's been harassing me, filing false complaints, and now she's straight up vandalizing my property." Carter nodded slowly, clearly processing everything. "We're gonna need a statement," he said. "And if this is what you say it is, she's about to have a very bad day." Miguel exhaled. It was happening. Mrs. Thompson was about to face real consequences. The arrest. Later that day, Miguel sat on his porch, waiting. At exactly 3:15 p.m., a black and white police cruiser pulled up to Mrs. Thompson's house. Miguel watched as 2 officers stepped out and knocked on her door. A few moments later, Mrs. Thompson opened it. Miguel couldn't hear what was being said, but he saw her expression shift, first to confusion, then to panic. One of the officers held up a tablet, showing her the video. Mrs. Thompson's face went pale. She started arguing, waving her arms around, but the officers weren't having it. Then, the handcuffs came out. Miguel almost couldn't believe it. He watched as Mrs. Thompson was arrested right there on her front porch, in broad daylight, with the entire neighborhood watching. For years, she had bullied and intimidated people. But today, she was the one being dragged away. And Miguel wasn't done yet. Because while Mrs. Thompson was sitting in the back of a police car, Miguel was about to expose the biggest secret of all. The missing HOA money. And when he did, she wouldn't just be facing vandalism charges. She'd be facing years in prison. Mrs. Thompson's arrest was the talk of the neighborhood. People stood on their porches, whispering to each other as she was escorted into the police car. Some looked shocked, others amused, and a few, those who had been victims of her harassment, looked downright pleased. But Miguel wasn't celebrating yet. Because he knew this wasn't over. Mrs. Thompson had done worse than vandalism. And he was about to prove it. The HOA's dirty secrets. Miguel knew the real crime wasn't what Mrs. Thompson had spray painted on his truck. It was what she had been doing with the HOA's money. So, while she sat in a police holding cell, Miguel went back to work. Breaking in, legally. With Mrs. Thompson temporarily out of the picture, Miguel figured she wouldn't be lurking around to stop him. He walked into the small HOA office, tucked near the neighborhood's entrance, and was greeted by Nancy, the part-time HOA secretary. She looked nervous. "Ah, hi, Miguel," she said hesitantly. "I heard about what happened." Miguel smiled. "Yeah, crazy, huh?" Nancy nodded, looking over her shoulder. "Look, I probably shouldn't be talking about this, but I've always felt like something was off. Karen kept everything locked up. She never let me handle financial documents." Miguel leaned in. "Nancy, if you know something, now is the time to come clean. The police are involved now. If she's been doing something illegal and you help expose it, you'll be on the right side of this." Nancy bit her lip. Then, after a long pause, she sighed. "There's a filing cabinet in the back. She never let anyone touch it." Miguel's heart pounded. Bingo! The missing money. Nancy led Miguel to a small room in the back of the HOA office. There it was, a locked cabinet, stuffed with folders and financial statements. Nancy handed him a key. "She always kept this in her desk," she whispered. Miguel didn't hesitate. He unlocked the cabinet and pulled out the files. And what he saw made his blood run cold. Page after page of financial records, showing thousands of dollars in HOA fees collected from homeowners. Money that was supposed to go toward community upkeep, road repairs, landscaping, security. But then, something strange. There were withdrawals. Large ones. $5,000 here. $3,200 there. $10,000 in a single transaction. And all of them had the same thing written in the notes section: administrative costs. But there were no receipts. No explanations. Just money disappearing. Miguel flipped through the folders, his hands shaking. It wasn't just a few missing dollars. Mrs. Thompson had stolen over $100,000 from the HOA. And Miguel had the proof. The neighborhood meeting. That evening, Miguel gathered every homeowner in the community for an emergency meeting. They filled the small community clubhouse, whispering, looking around, still in shock from the day's events. Miguel stood at the front of the room, holding up the files. "I know many of you were intimidated by Mrs. Thompson," he said. "I know she made life miserable for a lot of us." People nodded. "But what you didn't know is that she was also robbing you." The room went silent. Miguel held up a financial statement. "This document right here shows that over the past 3 years, Mrs. Thompson has taken over $100,000 from the HOA. Money that was supposed to go toward improving the neighborhood." Gasps spread through the room. "She didn't use it for repairs," Miguel continued. "She didn't use it for security or landscaping. She stole it. And now, she's going to pay for it." People murmured, some looking angry, others relieved. Then, an older man in the back stood up. "I knew she was crooked," he muttered. "She fined me $500 last year for having the wrong mailbox." A woman near the front shook her head. "She tried to kick me out for putting up a garden." More voices rose. "She fined me for parking in my own driveway." She rejected every complaint about the park being unsafe. "She was stealing from all of us." Miguel nodded. "And now, she's going to prison for it." The final blow. The next morning, Miguel met with Detective Carter, the officer handling Mrs. Thompson's vandalism case. He handed over the financial records, along with a signed statement from Nancy, the HOA secretary. Detective Carter flipped through the pages, his expression darkening. "This is bad," he muttered. "She's not just looking at a fine anymore. This is felony embezzlement." Miguel crossed his arms. "So what happens now?" Carter let out a slow breath. "We take this to the district attorney," he said. "And if this holds up in court?" He snapped the folder shut. She's looking at 10 years in prison. Miguel nodded, finally feeling relief for the first time since moving in. Mrs. Thompson had spent years bullying and stealing from people. Now, she was the one losing everything. It had been 3 days since Mrs. Thompson's arrest, and the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Some people thought she'd been released on bail. Others swore she was hiding in a hotel, waiting for her lawyer to clean up the mess. But Miguel knew better. He had spent the past few days working with Detective Carter, turning over every last piece of evidence against her. The police had everything they needed: financial records, witness statements, and even a signed confession from Nancy, the HOA secretary. Mrs. Thompson was done. Or so he thought. Because on the morning of the 4th day, Miguel woke up to a surprise. She was back. A public meltdown. Miguel had just stepped outside to grab his mail when he heard it, a car door slamming shut. He turned. There she was. Mrs. Thompson stood in her driveway, wearing dark sunglasses and a tight-lipped scowl. Her usual pristine appearance was gone, her hair was a mess, and she looked like she hadn't slept in days. Miguel watched her closely. Most people, after being arrested, would have laid low. But not her. Instead, she stormed across the street, straight toward Miguel. The second she reached his driveway, she pointed a shaking finger at him. "You did this to me," she hissed. Miguel sighed, crossing his arms. "You did this to yourself, Karen." Her face twisted with rage. "This is my community. I built this place. And now, because of you, everyone thinks I'm a criminal." Miguel raised an eyebrow. "Karen, you are a criminal." Her hands clenched into fists. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" she snapped. "But you don't belong here. I tried to warn you. People like you don't." She caught herself just in time, but Miguel saw it in her eyes. That same old hatred. Miguel exhaled slowly. "You know what your problem is, Karen," he said. "You spent so much time looking down on people, judging them, bullying them, that you never stopped to think that someone might fight back." Her face turned red. "You're gonna regret this," she seethed. "I have lawyers. Friends. People in the city who owe me favors. You think a nobody like you can." Miguel smiled. "Karen," he interrupted. "You should check the news." Her eyes flickered with doubt. Miguel pulled out his phone, opened a live news broadcast, and turned the screen toward her. There it was. A breaking news segment about her arrest. A reporter stood outside City Hall, speaking into the camera. Authorities have launched a full-scale investigation into the Willow Creek HOA scandal. According to sources, former HOA President Karen Thompson is accused of embezzling over $100,000 in HOA funds. The district attorney's office has confirmed that felony charges are being prepared. Karen's face drained of color. Then, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out with shaking hands and looked at the screen. Miguel could tell. It was bad news. Her lawyer, maybe. Or one of her friends, backing out. She slowly looked up at him. For the first time, Miguel saw it. Fear. She wasn't in control anymore. Miguel smiled. "Looks like your friends aren't coming to save you." Mrs. Thompson's mouth opened, then closed. She took a step back, her hands trembling. "You'll pay for this," she muttered, her voice weak. Miguel shrugged. "I already did," he said, glancing at his truck. "Literally. Had to replace all 4 tires, remember?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes darted around. She could see it, her neighbors watching from their porches. Some of them were recording on their phones. She had nowhere left to run. Then, without another word, she turned and rushed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. Miguel let out a slow breath. It was over. The final nail in the coffin. That afternoon, Detective Carter called. "She's done," he said. "The district attorney is filing charges. She won't be coming back from this." Miguel nodded. "Good." Carter hesitated. "You know, most people would have just moved out. Let her win." Miguel smirked. "Yeah, well, I don't run." Carter chuckled. No, you don't. Miguel hung up and leaned back in his chair, finally feeling at peace. Mrs. Thompson had spent years terrorizing this community. But now? She was the one who had to leave. And Miguel? He was just getting started. The morning of Mrs. Thompson's court hearing came faster than Miguel expected. By now, the entire neighborhood knew what she had done. The HOA had officially removed her as president, and the new leadership was cooperating with the police investigation. Homeowners had even started demanding refunds for the unjust fines she had issued over the years. Miguel? He was just waiting for the final moment, the moment she would face real consequences. And today, that moment had finally arrived. The courtroom showdown. Miguel sat in the packed courtroom, surrounded by other homeowners who had been victimized by Mrs. Thompson's corruption. At the front of the room, Mrs. Thompson sat at the defendant's table, looking pale and exhausted. Her once pristine confidence was gone. Her expensive lawyer whispered something to her, but she barely acknowledged him. She knew what was coming. Then, the judge entered the room, and the hearing began. The prosecutor stood up first. Your Honor, the state has gathered overwhelming evidence that the defendant, Karen Thompson, engaged in embezzlement, fraud, and vandalism. She used her position as HOA President to steal over $100,000 from homeowners. She harassed residents, issued false fines, and used intimidation tactics to keep her crimes hidden. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The prosecutor wasn't done. She also personally vandalized a homeowner's property, and we have video evidence proving this. Then, Miguel's video footage played on the courtroom screen. The entire room watched as Mrs. Thompson was caught spray painting illegal on Miguel's truck in the middle of the night. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Even the judge raised an eyebrow. When the video ended, the judge turned to Mrs. Thompson. Well, Ms. Thompson, he said, flipping through the case file, you've certainly been busy. Mrs. Thompson stared at the table, her face bright red. For the first time, she had nothing to say. The judge didn't waste any time. Ms. Thompson, the court finds you guilty of multiple offenses, including felony embezzlement and vandalism. He took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. You are hereby sentenced to 6 years in prison, followed by probation and full restitution of the stolen HOA funds. A collective gasp filled the room. Miguel exhaled, a wave of relief washing over him. She was finally getting what she deserved. Mrs. Thompson, on the other hand, looked like she was about to faint. She tried to plead with the judge, but it was too late. The bailiff approached, and the cuffs came out. Miguel watched as she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, this time, for good. The reign of Karen Thompson was officially over. The next few weeks were peaceful. With Mrs. Thompson gone, the HOA started rebuilding its reputation. The new leadership rolled back unfair fines, repaired neglected areas of the community, and even lowered fees now that they weren't covering for Karen's theft. And Miguel? He finally got to finish his renovations, without anyone harassing him. One evening, as he sat on his newly rebuilt porch, Nancy, the former HOA secretary, walked by. She smiled. You know, I've lived here for 15 years, and I've never seen the neighborhood like this. Relaxed. Happy. Miguel chuckled. Well, I guess when you get rid of a tyrant, people breathe a little easier. Nancy laughed. Then, she hesitated. I just wanted to say, thank you, she said. Most people wouldn't have fought back. They would have moved away. But you stayed. And you made a difference. Miguel smiled. Yeah, well, I'm stubborn like that. Nancy nodded. We're lucky to have you here, Miguel. She walked away, and Miguel leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset. For the first time since moving in, he felt at home. For the first time since moving in, Miguel finally felt at peace. No more false complaints. No more harassment. No more watchful eyes from across the street. Mrs. Thompson was gone, serving a 6-year prison sentence, and the neighborhood was starting over. But what happened next? Miguel never expected it. The unexpected invitation. One morning, Miguel received a letter in the mail, but this time, it wasn't a violation notice. It was an invitation. Dear Mr. Ramirez, the Willow Creek Homeowners Association would like to formally invite you to join the HOA Leadership Committee. We believe that, with your dedication to justice and fairness, you can help rebuild this community and ensure that the HOA serves all homeowners equally. Sincerely, the new HOA board. Miguel chuckled. A few months ago, he had been fighting against the HOA. Now? They wanted him to help run it. He wasn't sure at first. Did he really want to deal with HOA rules and meetings? But then, he thought about it. For years, the HOA had been a weapon, used to control and punish certain homeowners while protecting others. Maybe it was time to change that. Maybe it was time to make sure no one else went through what he did. So, he signed the letter and sent it back. Miguel Ramirez was now on the HOA board. And for the first time in years, the HOA was going to be fair. The neighborhood's transformation. Over the next few months, the neighborhood changed. Unfair fines were refunded. New rules were created to protect homeowners, not punish them. Repairs were finally made to neglected parts of the community. The homeowners, the same people who had been afraid to speak up, finally felt heard. And Miguel? He finally got to enjoy his home, the way he was meant to. One evening, as he stood outside watering his front yard, a car slowed down in front of his house. It was a young couple, looking at a house for sale on the street. Miguel saw the familiar look in their eyes, that mix of excitement and nervousness that came with moving into a new place. The woman rolled down her window. "Hey, is this a good neighborhood?" she asked. Miguel smiled. "It is now." And that's the story of how one man stood up to a corrupt HOA president and won. Miguel refused to be pushed out of his home. He refused to back down. And in the end, he not only defeated Karen Thompson, he transformed an entire community. Let me know in the comments, what would you have done if you were in Miguel's situation? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our next unbelievable story. Thanks for watching. See you next time.